A company's sales in Seattle were $400,000 in 2012, while their sales in Portland were $295,000 for the same year. Complete the following statements. Seattle's sales were blank percent larger than Portland's. Portland's sales were blank percent smaller than Seattle's. Portland's sales were blank percent of Seattle's. Give answers accurate to at least one decimal place. In this problem, we're asked for various percentages comparing Seattle's sales to Portland's sales. But there's a couple words that clue us in that there's some more in-depth things that we have to think about as we work this problem. Those words being larger than and smaller than. Let's start there. If I was to draw a picture of what's going on, I might do something like this. I might say that in Seattle, the sales were $400,000. Just draw a little picture just to get the idea of what's going on here. While in Portland, the sales were $295,000. And maybe I'll represent that with a slightly smaller circle. Visualizing this, I see that Seattle's sales is larger than Portland's sales. In fact, we're asked what percentage larger is Seattle's sales than Portland's sales? Well, if we're talking about larger than or smaller than, we're doing a comparison of the two. And when we're comparing the two, we're looking for a difference in between them. If we were to take Seattle's sales and find the difference between that number and Portland's sales, we would want to subtract those two values, 400,000 minus 295,000, and we would find that there's a $105,000 difference in between those two values. In fact, we could say that Seattle's sales are $105,000 larger than Portland's sales, and Portland's sales are $105,000 smaller than Seattle's sales. So this difference right here is going to become crucial in answering the percentages for parts A and B. Let's begin by focusing on part A. We'll restate what we just said a moment ago. That is, Seattle's sales were $105,000 larger than Portland's sales. Now, how do we convert this into a percent? Notice 105,000 is what we're comparing, and we're comparing it specifically to Portland's sales. That means we're going to be taking a percentage of the difference between Seattle and Portland's sales, namely 105,000, and we're going to divide it by Portland's sales, $295,000. Pulling out our calculator, we divide 105,000 divided by 295,000. And that gives us the decimal approximately 0.3559322, etc., etc., etc. Or rounding, well, first of all, hang on, converting to the percent gives us approximately 35.59322%. And going one more step now and giving an answer accurate to at least one decimal place means we go to the 5, look one right. Since 9 is larger than 5, we're going to go ahead and round up. So that tells me that our percent should be 35.6%. We can make the statement that Seattle's sales were 35.6% larger than Portland's. Let's take a look at part B. We'll restate again a statement we said earlier, which is that Portland's sales were $105,000 smaller than Seattle's sales. This statement's going to assist us as we determine the percentage for part B. In this example now, we're comparing the difference, $105,000, to Seattle sales. This gives me a hint as to the fraction or ratio that I'm going to set up to get our percentage. We're going to take our difference, which is $105,000, but this time we're going to divide it by Seattle's sales. Seattle's sales is $400,000. Pulling out a calculator, if we take $105,000 and we divide it by $400,000, we get approximately 0.2625. Converting that to a percentage gives us 26.25%. That is moving our decimal 2 places to the right. And finally, rounding to the nearest tenth, we look at the number 2, which is in the tenths position. Next to it is a 5. 5 and bigger means we round up. So that tells me the final answer is 26.3%. Or in other words, I could state that Portland's sales were 26.3% smaller than Seattle's sales. Now let's take a look at that last problem, or the last part to this problem. Namely, Portland's sales were blank percent of Seattle's. Let me clear a little space and notice this time when we're looking at part C, we're not comparing smaller than or larger than. So that whole idea of difference is not going to come into play. Instead, we're specifically comparing Portland's sales to Seattle's sales. Portland's is going to go in the numerator. Seattle's is going to go in the denominator. Portland sales as a percentage of Seattle sales can be written as a fraction where the Portland value's on top, namely $295,000, and Seattle's value or Seattle's total sales, $400,000, goes in the denominator. Comparing Portland sales to Seattle sales, we take $295,000. We divide by 400,000, and that gives us a decimal of 0.7375. Converting that to a percent means move 2 decimal places to the right. And that gives us 73.75%. Rounding to at least 1 decimal place or to 1 decimal place would give us 73.8%. We would say that Portland's sales were 73.8% of Seattle's sales. I hope this explanation helped. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to message me.